Well, good day everyone. Thank you very much for joining me in the great outdoors yet again here in our Chronological Bible Reading Plan. I'm sitting under our pergola because it started raining just a minute ago, so hopefully we can avoid that and get on with week number 28, an epic week in our readings, certainly as far as the narrative goes, because this week we see the death, the destruction, and the demise of Israel. Now, of course, you know, because you're reading the narrative along with me, that when I say Israel, I mean specifically the northern kingdom, Samaria, the capital city, otherwise known as Ephraim. That is what we mean when we say Israel, as opposed to Judah, who is in the south, because, of course, by now, as you've seen very clearly, I hope, we are dealing with a split kingdom. But that age of the divided kingdom is about to come to an end as we witness the demise of the north. All right, so far in our back and forth narrative between north and south, down the south, we've read about 10 kings. This week we're reading about one more, a guy called Ahaz, who's a bad king and everything goes, well, south for the people in the south. Up north, we're reading about their final king, number 19, their final king, a guy called Hoshea, and under his leadership, Israel is destroyed. Now, in a practical term, the way this happens is that a foreign nation called Assyria comes from the north and destroys them in a military conquest, okay? Kind of a common thing to happen back then. So that's practically how they are destroyed, and then they're deployed through and scattered throughout the nations. However, there's more to this than just something practical. There is more than this than meets the eye. God himself is behind this destruction. And that is what both the narrative and especially the prophets make very, very clear. God's people are not just defeated by an enemy because they were too weak. No, God's people are defeated by an enemy because God himself is behind it. Israel, the northern kingdom, because of their consistent idolatry and disobedience and breaking God's covenant, God himself says, I myself am going to punish you. I myself am going to reject you. I myself am going to cast you from my presence. Practically, it's a foreign nation that's taking them over and they're driven from the land. But spiritually speaking, this is the death of a covenant relationship. And that, remember, is what we saw happen right back in the Adam and Eve story. When Adam and Eve committed idolatry, they put something else before their relationship with God, okay? That relationship did not only end as in they experienced a covenantal death and the loss of God's presence. That's what happened spiritually or relationally. But physically speaking, they were also taken out of the Garden of Eden. So this association with the physical land and the removal from God's presence now continues in the story of Israel. God says, I've thrust you from my presence, and he is casting them, practically speaking, from the promised land. All right, so that's what you're going to see in this week's narrative, and it especially comes through in the ministry of the prophet. So, here we go. This week we are reading 4 chapters of narrative, and that's pretty straightforward. You'll see that. 2 Kings 17 is a whole summary about this destruction. Very, very, very important. An absolute pivotal chapter, 2 Kings 17. But this week I want to spend most of my time talking about the prophets. We're going to start Isaiah, a massive prophetic book that's going to take us a few weeks to finish because he prophesies over about 60-year period, okay? But this week we're going to read Amos and Micah. They're 2 little books. Amos is 9 chapters, Micah is 7. I insist you read each of those books in one sitting. I'm sure by now you're used to me saying that, all right? Amos and Micah, basically together with Hosea that we'll read last week, they're basically 3 peas in a pod. They're very, very similar prophets. Amos and Micah in particular, they're both country boys, okay, from the south, who prophesied the destruction of the north about 10 to 40 years before it happens. Hosea is similar. He also prophesies about the destruction of Samaria. Both say that this is the Lord's doing. Okay, so again, they confirm that. This isn't just a physical army coming in to destroy a physical city. No, this is God himself is behind this. God himself coming like a lion to attack his people. God himself stirring up this nation against them. But the only thing about Amos and Micah is that they don't know which nation it is. They don't name Assyria. Okay, that's up to Isaiah and Hosea to prophesy that. At this stage, the foreign invaders are unnamed. But according to these prophets, this is key, this event in spiritual terms is referred to, get this, as the day of the Lord. Okay, it's the day of the Lord. Practically speaking, it's an army coming in, invading and destroying. But covenantally speaking, relationally speaking, this is the day of the Lord. It's a day of darkness where all the lights are out. It's basically lights out on Israel. Okay? It's a day where mountains shake and valleys burn up. It is a cataclysmic day with covenantal language. And so as you read the prophets this week, you're going to be reminded of what we saw way back with David when we read the narrative in Samuel and then the Psalms. Remember, the narrative was very matter of fact. This is what happened. But the Psalms were dramatic. They were emotional. They were exaggerated language. Well, that's what we see here in the prophets. Kings and Chronicles, very matter of fact. But the prophets are exaggerating. They're speaking in hyperbole. They're calling Israel, you're just like Egypt. You're just like Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay? And the reason they're doing that is because prophets speak in poetry. And so they're very dramatic in their covenantal description of what is taking place. But the other thing that both of the prophets have in common is that they both have hints of hope right at the end of their books, which is great because if you read Kings and Chronicles, there's no hint of any hope there. It's like, lights out, God's done with Israel, that's it, finished. But when you read the prophets, you realize, there's actually hope that is prophesied here as well, which is great because Micah and Amos, the other thing they have in common is neither of them are mentioned in the narrative. We wouldn't even know they existed were it not for God retaining these prophetic books. So super, super glad that we have them in our Bible. And when he talks about the hope, they talk about David's tent, this united kingdom that's now divided, somehow coming together, that somehow this will be done by a king who will come from Bethlehem. Who could that be? Who will also be a shepherd to God's people and gather his people into one sheep pen. I mean, all these prophecies come at this period of time, over 7 to 800 years BC. That's what we're reading about this week, where somehow in the future, God will forgive their sins and a remnant will return and be restored. All right. So there are hints of hope in there. The point is this: Amos and Micah are like two peas in a pod, okay, very similar prophets. Both are from Judah, prophesying the end of the northern kingdom, but both also declare hints of hope for restoration, which is very important to take note of. Isaiah is a major prophet. We're going to read the first 12 chapters of him today, this week. I'm not going to say too much about him today because we're going to be stuck in Isaiah for quite a few weeks, okay, into the future. But essentially, Isaiah is quite similar. Unlike Amos and Micah, though, he's actually a city boy from Jerusalem. So he's down here in the south. And he doesn't just focus on Israel. He prophesies to everyone, okay? So one of the things we need to be real careful of when we read Isaiah is paying attention to the audience that he is prophesying to. Sometimes it's the south, sometimes it's the north, sometimes it's all the other surrounding nations. He has a go at all of them, okay? So we really, as we work through Isaiah, we need to pay attention to the audience. We need to pay attention to time statements, okay? This week, the first 5 chapters of Isaiah have no time attached to them. They're very general prophecies. Some of them apply to Judah, some of them apply to the north, some of them seem to apply to both. Okay, the first 5 chapters are just boom, a bunch of prophecies put together, and then suddenly the narrative or the time statements begin. So Isaiah's not presented all that chronologically. It's not really a history book. It's a history book with a whole bunch of prophetic poetry mixed in, which makes it, quite complex and whatever. But anyway, again, pay attention to the language in Isaiah. You're going to read a lot of stuff that's going to remind you of the New Testament. A heap of stuff that's going to remind you of the New Testament. And you're also going to read language that's going to remind you of Moses. Because when Moses pronounced the curse of the law, okay, the prophets come and they repeat a lot of that language. All right? Anyway, we're going to look at Isaiah in the next few weeks. The point is this for this week. Here's the point, Chad. In the law, God said whenever a major judgment is to take place in your courts, make sure you have the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Remember that? Well, thankfully, God practices what he preaches. before he executes a major judgment on the northern kingdom, he makes sure that there are 3 or 4 witnesses, if you look at Hosea next week, who are all prophesying the same thing, calling Israel out on their sin against the law of Moses. When it comes to reading the narrative this week is very straightforward. Israel is destroyed by Assyria. That's it. But when it comes to reading the prophets, we understand that behind what happens physically, there is a deep covenantal reality, full of covenantal language, and amidst all the covenantal judgment are hints of hope for the future. And fortunately for you and I, who've read the end of the book, we know that those hints of hope have everything to do with Jesus. So again, look for Jesus in the readings this week. I'm sure, like me, you'll find, I may not say dozens, but many examples of where Jesus fits in to the hints of hope for the disaster that is happening up north. All right, enjoy, guys. Remember, read those prophets, Amos and Micah, in one sitting, and all the best with Isaiah. And I'll catch you next week.